The heavy oak door of the prince's private study was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, golden light spilled out onto the polished marble floor of the corridor, a stark contrast to the cold, ancient stone of the rest of the palace. For the past hour, the sound filtering through that gap had been the low, indistinct murmur of men's voices. Inside, 8-year-old Prince Louis, the second son of the king, was supposed to be finishing his Latin translations with his new tutor. Outside, in the shadows, stood Elias Thorne. He wasn't a soldier in a polished breastplate or a nobleman with a gilded sword. Elias was a watchman, a member of the palace's night guard. His post was this very corridor, a seemingly insignificant passage leading to the private quarters of the younger royal children. His uniform was simple: sturdy boots, dark wool trousers, and a leather jerkin over a linen shirt. The only indication of his authority was the heavy iron ring of keys at his belt and the solid cudgel hanging from his side. He was a man made of quiet observation and stillness, a piece of the palace furniture that most people, especially the nobility, never really saw. The murmur from the study stopped. Elias straightened slightly, his senses dulled by the monotony of the watch suddenly sharpening. A moment of silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a small, choked cry quickly muffled. It wasn't a shout of anger or a yell of surprise. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pain, the kind a child makes when they are hurt and terrified. Before he could even process the sound, the study door was wrenched open. Prince Louis stumbled out, his small face pale as milk. His dark eyes, usually bright with childish mischief, were wide with shock and brimming with unshed tears. He clutched his right arm to his chest, his hand held at an odd, unnatural angle. He didn't see Elias at first. He just stood there, trembling. Then he turned. His eyes met Elias's. For a second there was a flicker of pure fear, as if he expected the watchman to be another threat. But Elias did not move. He didn't rush forward or speak. He simply held the boy's gaze, his own face a mask of calm, unshakable presence. In that silent exchange, something passed between them. The boy saw not a servant, not a guard, but a witness. From inside the room, a man's voice called out, calm and controlled. "Your Highness, we are not finished. Come back inside." It was the new tutor, Lord Ashworth. He appeared in the doorway, a tall, impeccably dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard and cold, calculating eyes. He looked down at the prince, then his gaze flickered to Elias. A micro-expression of annoyance, quickly suppressed, crossed his features. "The prince has had a small accident," Lord Ashworth said smoothly, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being believed. "He tripped. I was just about to call for the physician." But the boy, little Louis, shook his head vehemently, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. He looked from the tutor's cold face to Elias's steady one. He opened his mouth, but for a moment no sound came out. Then his voice, high and clear, cut through the tense silence of the corridor. "He harmed me." The words hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Lord Ashworth's smile tightened. "Your Highness is confused. He is tired from his studies. You know how clumsy you can be." The prince didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Elias. "He twisted my arm. He said I wasn't trying hard enough." The boy's voice trembled, but it did not break. Elias Thorne had a choice. He was a watchman. His job was to patrol, to observe, to report a fire or a stray dog. He was not to get involved in the affairs of the royal family. To accuse a man like Lord Ashworth, a man with connections to the powerful Duke of Norfolk, a man who had been personally appointed by the king's own advisor, was professional suicide. It was worse than that. It was a path that could lead to the dungeons, or worse, to a quiet disappearance. His word against a lord's? He was a nobody, a palace fixture. His testimony would be dismissed in a heartbeat. He could simply say he saw nothing. He could accept Lord Ashworth's explanation of a fall. It was the safe, the smart, the logical thing to do. He looked at the prince. The boy was small and scared and in pain. He was a child standing alone against a powerful man with only a silent watchman for an audience. Elias thought of his own son, a boy of similar age who lived with his mother in a small cottage in the village outside the palace walls. He thought of someone twisting his son's arm, the rage that would boil inside him. He looked back at Lord Ashworth. The man's calm was a facade. Elias could see the tension in his jaw, the barely concealed threat in his eyes. Elias made his decision. It wasn't a grand, heroic choice. It was a quiet, fundamental one. He was a watchman, and his duty, he realized in that moment, was not just to the stones of the palace, but to the people within it, especially the vulnerable ones. He did not speak to Lord Ashworth. He did not argue. He simply reached up and pulled the cord that hung by the sconce on the wall. It was the alarm for the main guardhouse, a rope he had been told 100 times never to pull except in the case of a direct threat to the royal family. This, he reasoned, was just that. The effect was instantaneous. A bell, dull and urgent, began to toll somewhere deep in the palace. It was a sound not heard in years, a sound that jolted every guard, every servant, every courtier from their nightly routine. It was the sound of crisis. Lord Ashworth's face went white, then red with fury. "You fool!" he hissed, taking a step towards Elias. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elias didn't flinch. He moved, placing his own solid body between the tutor and the prince. He didn't draw his cudgel, but his hand rested on it. He said nothing. He just waited. The clatter of boots on stone grew louder. Within moments, the corridor was flooded with guards in full regalia, their swords drawn, their faces grim. Captain Reynolds, a battle-hardened veteran with a scarred face, pushed his way to the front. He looked at the scene, the trembling prince, the furious tutor, and the stoic watchman standing by the pulled alarm cord. "Report!" the captain barked, his eyes scanning for an enemy. Elias finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of undeniable truth. "The prince says Lord Ashworth harmed him, Captain. He is injured." Captain Reynolds' gaze fell to the prince's arm. He was a man who had seen countless battlefield wounds. He recognized the look of a break, the way the boy held himself. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't question the source. He saw the child's pain and the watchman's unshakable calm. He snapped his fingers. "You two, escort the prince to the royal physician. Now! Gently!" Then he turned his cold, hard stare on Lord Ashworth. "My lord, you will come with me." Lord Ashworth sputtered, his composure crumbling. "This is an outrage! The boy fell! This peasant has overstepped his bounds. I demand to see the king." "The king will be informed," Captain Reynolds said, his voice devoid of emotion. He nodded to two of his men who flanked the tutor. They didn't touch him, but their presence was an inescapable cage. As they led him away, Lord Ashworth shot Elias a look of pure, venomous hatred. It was a promise. The corridor emptied as quickly as it had filled. The alarm bell fell silent. Elias was left alone once more. He stood in the same spot, but everything had changed. His hands were trembling slightly. He had just crossed a line from which there was no return. He had made a powerful enemy. He had, in all likelihood, ended his career. But as he looked down at the spot where the little prince had stood, at the small, scuffed footprint on the marble floor, he felt no regret. Only a deep, profound certainty that he had done the only thing he could. The aftermath was swift and brutal, as Elias had known it would be. The next morning he was summoned not to a commendation, but to the office of the chamberlain, a man who answered not to the captain of the guard, but to the king's senior advisor, the very man who had recommended Lord Ashworth. The chamber was ornate, smelling of beeswax and old parchment. The chamberlain, a thin man with a permanent sneer, didn't ask for Elias's account. He simply read from a document. "Watchman Thorne, it is alleged that you grossly overstepped your authority last night, pulling a high-level alarm based on the hysterical claim of a child, causing undue distress and alarm throughout the palace. Furthermore, you made a grave and unfounded accusation against a respected member of the royal household. Your actions have brought shame upon the uniform you wear. You are hereby dismissed from the king's service, effective immediately. Your final wages will be held to cover the cost of the disruption you have caused. Your personal effects will be brought to the gate. You are to leave the palace grounds within the hour." Elias listened in silence. He had expected no less. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned, and walked out. The guards at the door looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a pariah. He had broken the first rule of the palace: you do not embarrass the powerful. He walked through the grand corridors for the last time, past the gilded paintings and the haughty courtiers who now looked through him as if he were already a ghost. He reached the small, cramped room in the servants' quarters that had been his home for 5 years. He packed his few belongings: a spare shirt, a worn copy of a book of fables, a small wooden bird his son had carved for him. He tied them in a cloth bundle and walked out into the cold morning air. At the great gate, the guard who had been his colleague just yesterday wouldn't meet his eyes. He handed Elias his bundle and closed the heavy iron gate behind him with a resounding clang. Elias Thorne, watchman of the palace, was now a man without a position, without a reference, standing on the wrong side of the wall he had sworn to protect. He walked down the hill towards the village, his future as bleak and gray as the winter sky. He thought of his ex-wife Martha and how this news would land. He was behind on the small payments he sent for their son Thomas. Now there would be nothing. The shame of it burned in his chest, a fiercer pain than any anger he felt. For 2 weeks he drifted. He found a corner to sleep in a hayloft belonging to a sympathetic farmer who remembered him from his childhood. He picked up odd jobs: mending a fence, hauling water, chopping wood, for a few coins, barely enough for a loaf of bread. He was becoming invisible in a different way now, not as a purposeful fixture, but as a forgotten man. The story of his dismissal, twisted and poisoned, had already spread through the village. He was the fool who had accused a lord and gotten what he deserved. Men who had once nodded to him now crossed the street. Then, on a raw, damp afternoon, a boy came running to the hayloft. It was a lad from the village, out of breath. "Elias, there's a man, a soldier, at the blacksmith's. He's asking for you." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Was this it? Had Lord Ashworth's promise of hatred finally arrived in the form of a quiet arrest? He had no choice but to go. He walked into the village, his stomach tight with dread. Waiting by the smithy's forge, steam rising from his damp cloak, was a young guard he recognized. It was one of the men who had been in the corridor that night. His name was Private Wells. Private Wells looked nervous. He glanced around before stepping forward. "Watchman Thorne," he said quietly, the old title strange on his lips. "I'm no watchman," Elias said flatly. "What do you want?" The young soldier leaned closer. "You need to come with me. There's someone who wants to see you." "If it's an arrest, get it over with," Elias said, a flicker of defiance in his tired eyes. Wells shook his head, a strange look on his face. "No, not an arrest. It's the prince, Prince Louis." Elias stared at him, uncomprehending. The prince? Why would the prince want to see him? He followed Wells not back up the main road to the palace, but through a series of back lanes to a small, walled garden that bordered the royal grounds. It was a private entrance, used by the family. Wells knocked a pattern on a small wooden door. It opened. They were led through a kitchen garden and into a quiet, warm sitting room in a part of the palace Elias had never seen. And there, sitting on a cushioned chair, his arm in a neat white sling, was Prince Louis. He looked smaller without the vast corridor around him, but his eyes were clear and serious. Standing behind him was a woman with a kind, worried face, his nurse, a sturdy woman named Agnes. The prince slid off his chair the moment Elias entered. He walked straight up to him and looked up into his face. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he reached out his good hand and took Elias's rough, work-worn fingers in his own small, soft ones. "I'm sorry," the prince said, his voice quiet but clear. "I heard what they did to you. They sent you away because you helped me." Elias was struck speechless. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "Your Highness," he began, his own voice thick, "you owe me no apology. I did what any man should have done." The prince shook his head firmly. "No, they didn't. The other guards, they look away. My tutor, he was mean before. He would pinch me when I got my lessons wrong, but that night he was angry. He hurt me, and you were the only one who saw, the only one who did something." He looked back at his nurse, who gave him an encouraging nod. The boy turned back to Elias. "I told my father, the king, I told him everything. About the pinches, about my arm, about how you pulled the rope and stood in front of me. He was very angry, not at me, at Lord Ashworth, and at the men who sent you away." A flicker of hope, so faint he barely dared to acknowledge it, ignited in Elias's chest. "The king?" Prince Louis nodded. "Lord Ashworth is gone. Father sent him away, far away, and he was very angry with the chamberlain. He shouted. I heard him." A small, secret smile touched the boy's lips. He looked back at Elias. "My father wants to see you. He wants to thank you. And I wanted to see you first, to tell you, and to thank you myself." At that moment, the door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man entered the room. He was dressed simply in a dark riding coat and boots, but his presence filled the space instantly. It was King Alexander. He had the same clear, serious eyes as his son. He looked at Elias, still kneeling before the prince, and a ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Rise, Watchman," the king said, his voice a deep rumble. Elias stood, his heart pounding. The king studied him for a long moment. "My son has told me everything. He is a truthful boy. He has also told me that you are a man of honor, a rare commodity in this palace." The king gestured for Elias to follow him to a window overlooking the gardens. He spoke in a low voice meant only for Elias. "Lord Ashworth was a creature of my advisor, Lord Weston. He was placed here to influence my son, to mold him. When Louis resisted, he resorted to cruelty. Your intervention exposed not only a vile man, but a wider rot. Lord Weston has been relieved of his duties and is under investigation. You, Elias Thorne, by a single act of courage, have done more for the security of my house than any general in my army." Elias didn't know what to say. He simply stood there, absorbing the king's words. King Alexander turned to face him directly. "I cannot undo the injustice you suffered, but I can offer you a choice. You can have a purse of gold, enough to buy a small farm and live comfortably for the rest of your days. It would be a just reward for your service." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. Then he continued, "Or you can have your old job back, but not as a night watchman on a forgotten corridor. I am creating a new position, a personal guard for my son, someone who will be with him always, in the classroom, in the gardens, everywhere. Someone he trusts, someone of honor. The pay is 5 times what you made before. There is a small cottage on the palace grounds for you and your family." Elias thought of the gold. He thought of the farm, of a quiet life away from the treachery and cold stone of the palace. He thought of his son, Thomas. And then he looked past the king, to where Prince Louis stood by his nurse. The boy was watching them, his small face filled with a hope that mirrored the one flickering in Elias's own chest. He saw the trust in those young eyes. He saw a child who still needed someone to stand in front of him. He turned back to the king. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady, "I was a watchman. It's all I know. I would be honored to watch over your son." The king's smile was genuine this time. He nodded, a simple, decisive gesture. "Good. It is done." That evening, Elias Thorne walked back through the great gate of the palace. But he was not the same man who had been cast out. He was led not to a servant's closet, but to a small, charming stone cottage nestled within the palace walls. It had a garden, a real fireplace, and 2 small bedrooms. The next morning, a letter was dispatched to his ex-wife, Martha, along with a heavy purse of coins and a formal request for a meeting to discuss a new arrangement for their son. Elias's first official act in his new role was to accompany Prince Louis to his new study with his new tutor, a kind, elderly scholar hand-picked by the king himself. As the boy sat down to his lessons, he glanced back at Elias, who stood quietly by the door. The prince gave him a small, secret smile. Elias returned it with a slight nod. He was a watchman again, but now he was watching over something infinitely precious. He had pulled an alarm, and in doing so, had not just saved a prince from a moment of pain, he had found his own place, his own purpose, and a future he had never dared to imagine. The cold, silent corridor was a world away. He was home.